everyone. So this is going to be the first slide set of 2 for chapter 12. There's quite a lot of material here, so make sure that you're following along in the textbook. So with the last slide set, we left off talking about Homo erectus. We talked about Homo erectus being the first species of hominins to leave Africa, the first species of hominins to really have human-like aspects to their behavior and anatomy. We see full human height, we see brain sizes really starting to accelerate, we see a lot of meat consumption. Meat consumption is something that is driving and allowing for the large increases in brain size that we see. So they become really intensive meat eaters, actively hunting large game, and that is allowing for the type of nutrition needed to develop a large brain. So we're going to be talking about the origins of modern humans from here on out. We will also talk about a few other species as well. We'll cover Neanderthals, and we'll cover a few species that have been discovered in recent years that were evolutionary dead ends, but interesting nonetheless. So we're going to be talking about what was going on in hominin evolution during the Middle Pleistocene. So mid-Pleistocene Homo is what we're talking about here. Here is a drawing, a depiction of an artist's depiction of what one of these individuals would have looked like. So as you can see, we've really transitioned from more ape-looking animals, more chimp-looking animals, to species that look a lot more human. If you saw this guy walking down the street, you might think he looked a little weird, but you definitely wouldn't think that it wasn't a modern human. Okay, so we've been talking about the Pleistocene. As it says here, the Pleistocene is referred to sometimes as the Ice Age because we have a lot of retreats and advances of massive continental glaciations. So as it says here, we have during the Pleistocene at least 15 major and 50 minor glacial advances that have been documented in Europe. And what's corresponding with these glacial advances and retreats is pretty dramatic climate changes. So we have climate changes happening globally, it's not just in Europe, and this affects both flora and fauna, which in turn impacts hominins. So the period that we're going to be talking about today is the Middle Pleistocene. As you can see here on the slide, that is defined as 780,000 years ago up until about 25,000 years ago. So during these glacial events, the glaciers themselves, these ice sheets themselves, are confined to the northern latitudes, so far into northern Europe. You can see on the map there, this Scandinavian ice sheet covers most of what is today Scandinavia and part of Great Britain. So that's where the actual glacial ice sheet was, but much more of Europe was basically uninhabitable because of very cold tundra-like conditions. So what happens in the northern latitudes in Europe and northern Asia is basically that we have these really rapidly dramatic cold trends that are happening. We don't just have a lot of climate change happening in these northern latitudes, things change in other parts of the world as well. So in southern Asia and Africa, the climate is a lot drier and more arid, and the deserts expand. So again, this is important to consider because we're talking about changing food resources, really dramatic changes in climate that are going to be affecting human hominin behavior, migration routes, diet, all of that kind of stuff. In these interglacial periods, the temperatures get warmer, the ice sheets melt, the glaciers get smaller and retreat towards the poles, and we have much more temperate climates in the northern latitudes. So we have warmer climates, human populations can move into those areas, and then in the southern latitudes closer to the equator, the climate becomes wetter. So this map is just showing what happens in Africa during these climate shifts. So on the left is the interglacial period, this kind of medium almost flesh tone color here is showing what parts of Africa are covered in savannas. So savannas would be open grasslands, and then of course we have a large swath of Central Africa being dominated by forests. So this is what's going on in Africa when we have these interglacial periods. So the interglacial period is the warmer period between these glacial events. So we have increased rainfall, and then over here in the glacial period, so when these large ice sheets begin to form, basically they are taking up a bunch of the water in the environment. So instead of that water being available in the ocean or being available as rain, it is contained in these ice sheets in the northern latitudes. So the overall effect during these glacial periods is that we have reduced rainfall, things are drier, sea level is lower, the deserts expand, etc., etc. So what's going on in Africa during this time is that we have the Sahara expanding quite a lot. The Sahara doesn't even exist during the interglacial periods. And we also have other parts of Africa that are really arid. We only have small pockets here of savanna-like conditions, and the forests of Central Africa are still present, but they're much smaller in scale. So pretty dramatic changes happening in Africa. In Eurasia, we have likewise some pretty significant changes. In the glacial periods, we'll look over here on the right first. The glacial periods, this Scandinavian ice sheet is covering, as you can see, a huge chunk of northern Europe. These arrows, the red arrows, are indicating movements of populations during glacial periods. So basically the glaciers are expanding, climate is getting colder, the tundra is expanding, and it's pushing populations to the south. So human populations, hominin populations during these glacial periods are going to be confined to right around the Mediterranean, essentially. On the left, the interglacial periods, these populations are able to move back into northern Europe. The ice sheet melts completely. And so the climate is different. It's dramatically different between all of these climate shifts throughout the Pleistocene, and it has a big impact on what's going on with hominin populations. Okay, so these are not species that you're going to be expected to know. Most of them we're not really going to cover. In the interest of time and in the interest of simplicity, we're going to make things as simple as possible. But we'll just leave it at saying that there's a lot of debate in the field about how many species of hominins exist on the planet during this time period, during the Middle Pleistocene. There's a lot of variation. There's a lot of morphological variation, all kinds of stuff like that, and this really comes down to something we talked about earlier in the semester, which is this kind of debate between lumpers and splitters. So some people think that all of these hominins that exist during the Middle Pleistocene are the same species. All of them could be called Homo sapiens. Others believe that there are multiple species living in various parts of the world during this time period, and they name all of these species listed here. So as I said, we are just going to keep things as simple as possible for the purposes of this class. Okay, so what were the earliest pre-modern humans like? During the mid-Pleistocene, we have a mix of more primitive characteristics that are more similar to Homo erectus, and we also have more modern-looking conditions as well. So the Homo erectus-like conditions include having a very large, kind of heavy face, having a projecting brow. You can see in the picture here on the slide that brow ridge is just enormous. Having a low forehead, so the forehead is basically non-existent. It kind of just slopes back. They definitely didn't have vertical foreheads like humans have. And a thick cranial vault. So overall, very thick, heavy, robust skulls. We also have more modern conditions, including an increased brain size, more rounded brain case. So as the brain is getting bigger, the brain case is becoming a little bit more round to accommodate that. And we also have a more vertical face here. The face is becoming flatter and flatter. Remember, this is a trend we've talked about off and on throughout the last couple of chapters. The general trend is that as we move towards modern humans, towards modernity, faces get flatter and flatter. So rather than having that projecting, prognathic face of an ape, we are transitioning towards a more flat face like modern humans. And we have a less angled occipital. The occipital region of the skull is this back part here, the base of the skull. Basically what this just means is that the overall shape of the skull is getting rounder, it's getting less angled, it's getting more modern. Okay, so we'll talk about a couple, just like a few species here. Again, we're keeping it as simple as possible. Homo heidelbergensis, first found in Germany in 1907. We have a date range between 200 and 600,000 years ago. We're in the thousands now, and a brain size of 1,200 to 1,400 cc's. So this is almost into modern human range, very, very close at least. For that reason, some people call this archaic Homo sapiens, meaning pre-modern. Basically, to make a long story short, we're looking at slightly primitive looking hominins that look more or less modern. So we have a transition from Homo erectus to heidelbergensis, including a brain expansion and a more rounded cranium. One thing to keep in mind is that these Homo heidelbergensis are living in very cold parts of Europe. Even during, I mean, they're still occupying Europe during the glacial periods, just not as extensively. And they are occupying parts of Europe that it would be essentially impossible to live in successfully without control of fire. So we are fairly certain that they fully control fire as a means of surviving the cold winters in this part of the world. Okay, we also have some heidelbergensis from Africa. So this is a species that's been found in both Africa and in Europe. These two sites, one at Kabwe in Zambia and one at Bodo in Ethiopia, are good examples of African Homo heidelbergensis. Brain sizes are roughly similar, ranging for the two between 1,200 and 1,285 cc's. The dates are a little bit different. For Bodo, we have about 600, and for Kabwe, somewhere between 200 and 400. And as you can see, generally the two specimens look pretty similar. They both have really heavy brow ridges. They're overall pretty robust and all of that. Now, one thing that I'll say about that's shown to be true about a lot of heidelbergensis specimens is that they have evidence of butchering. So what I mean here is that this skull, this fossil here, has evidence that someone was scraping soft tissue off of it with a stone tool. So we see similar cut marks to the surface of the skull that we see when a hominin is butchering an animal of some kind. So we don't know exactly what was going on. It's been suggested maybe it was cannibalism. Who knows? But it is actually not terribly uncommon to find heidelbergensis specimens with evidence of butchering on the skulls. This is a site, Atapuerca is a site in Spain called Cima de los Huesos. It's in the Atapuerca Hills in Spain. This is an important site because it appears to possibly be the first intentional burial. So it dates a minimum of 350,000 years, and it's possibly as old as 600,000 years. Now, this is a site, as I said, it's in a mountain range in northern Spain, and basically it's a shaft. It's kind of a cave. There's like a cave, and it has a deep shaft in it, and the shaft is full of Homo heidelbergensis specimens. So there's not much else in there. I think there's a couple of other things that are down in this hole, but it's almost entirely heidelbergensis specimens. So 500 plus fossils have been found in this pit, and the MNI, which just means minimum number of individuals, is 28. So there's at least 28 individuals that have been buried in this pit. The thought process is possibly that this was a very early example of a burial in which hominins were trying to basically find a practical way of getting rid of dead members of their group. So there doesn't seem to be a ritual component yet. We don't really have that happening culturally as of this point, but Cima de los Huesos seems it possibly is the first example of an intentional burial occurring with a hominin species. As far as tools and cultures go, mid-Pleistocene tool and culture includes the advanced Acheulean. So here are some tools here. Same basic thing we talked about with the last slide set, a high level of standardization for these tools. So there's a level of sophistication here. We also have some tools that have been found that are made out of wood. This does not mean that earlier hominins weren't using wood tools. It just basically means that they didn't preserve well in the fossil record because wood will degrade a lot earlier than a stone tool will. We also have evidence that they were exploiting marine resources, living in simple dwellings, and possibly practicing cannibalism. Like I said, there have been quite a few fossils that have shown evidence of butchery. This site, Schnongen in Germany, is a site where the first wooden spears were found, the earliest wooden spears dating to about 400,000 years ago. This is an important site because it's the site where the oldest wooden artifacts have been found, as I said, and they're also the oldest known weapons. So these are tools that were definitely being used as weapons for hunting. As it says here on the slide, they were found with butchered wild horses. So it shows that hominins were definitely active hunters, which we kind of already knew. We knew that they were hunting, actively hunting with Homo erectus as well. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about Neanderthals. I'm not going to go through all of this. I do want you to go through the slides and to read through your book, but in the interest of keeping these recordings on the shorter side, we're not going to go over all of this information with the voice recording. So you will be responsible for the information that's in the slides, even though I'm not going to be going over all of it with the voice recordings. Okay, so Neanderthals are a species of hominin, an extinct species of hominin that lived in Europe and in parts of Western Asia. They arose out of a Heidelbergensis population living in Europe, so they appear to be descended from Heidelbergensis. What we see basically is a transition in Europe starting at about 350,000 years up until about 135,000 years, where we see specimens that look like a cross between Heidelbergensis and Neanderthals. So we're seeing the evolution of this species in action in the fossil record. We have a gradual accumulation of these traits over time during this time period, 350 to 135. From 135 to 35, we have the specimens that have the full suite of classic Neanderthal traits. Those are listed later in the slide, later in the slide set. And then after 35, we have about a 10,000 year period where we have specimens that look like hybrids between Neanderthals and modern humans, which is exactly what they are. They are specimens with mixed Neanderthal and anatomically modern human traits. So this accretion model is the model that I was just mentioning. We have this gradual accumulation of Neanderthal traits happening over a few 100,000 years. Neanderthals likely arose via anagenesis from a Heidelbergensis population in Europe. So I'm going to let you go through the traits on your own. They're pretty simple. You can see illustrations in your textbook, and you can look at some of these pictures on the slides as well. A lot of the differences are pretty obvious, both in the cranium and in the body. So the bodies are shaped a little bit differently. Again, you can go through that yourself. As far as culture goes, the Mousterian tool industry is primarily what the Neanderthals used, so it's something that's a little bit more advanced beyond the Acheulean. We won't go into any more details than that, other than to say that they had a set of different types of tools that were used for different things. So there's more complexity to the type of tools that Neanderthals are using. We know that they lived in settlements, they lived in open sites, rock shelters, and in caves, and that they controlled fire. We know that they were hunting large animals, and that they did probably not have technology for long-distance weapons. So they were having to get kind of up close and personal while hunting these large animals, like up close enough to basically stab the animal. We know that they most likely had some form of speech. We don't know a lot about what kind of speech they had, but there's been a lot of research looking at the anatomy of their throats and their genetics, and there are some indications that they probably had human-like speech. It may not have been exactly the same as human speech, but something approaching human speech. We also know that they practiced deliberate burials. We have deliberate Neanderthal burials with a ritual component starting at about 90,000 years. As far as Neanderthals and modern humans go, there have been a lot of genetic studies over the last 10 or 12 years that have come out. Scientists were able to find and sequence DNA in Neanderthal fossils, so we actually know a lot about Neanderthal genetics at this point. And we know that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred with each other. We know that their divergence occurred somewhere between 270 and 440,000 years ago, and they went along their own trajectory from that point. Now, one thing that I didn't mention before but is important is that Homo heidelbergensis is a really good candidate for the last common ancestor between Neanderthals and humans. So if you'll remember, heidelbergensis was living all over Europe and all over Africa. What most likely happened, what seems to have happened, is that the European population evolved into Neanderthals and the African population evolved into modern humans. Now, the Neanderthals went extinct at around 30,000 years ago. We're not exactly sure why, but the Iberian Peninsula, meaning modern-day Spain and Portugal, is the last refugia. That just means that that's the last place that these hominins lived before they went extinct. We're not really sure why they went extinct. There's a couple of hypotheses listed here. Extinction by violence is unlikely. The idea would be that humans perpetrated some kind of attack on the Neanderthals. There's no evidence of that. They could have just been outcompeted by modern humans. Modern humans may have had some kind of more sophisticated behavior and it just kind of been better suited to the environment. There's a lot of evidence, though, that they were absorbed into the anatomically modern human population through interbreeding. Okay, so a few more things. The Denisovans, or I guess I should properly pronounce it as the Denisovans. Not very much is known about this species. They were found, just a few finger bones actually were found in a cave in Siberia years ago, and nothing is known about the morphology, so that's kind of why I have the picture here that I do. We don't know anything about what they look like. We have a finger bone and some teeth, essentially. Fortunately, Siberia is cold and dry enough that it did a lot to preserve the DNA, so we know a lot more about the DNA of the Denisovans than we do about their actual morphology. So they were able to sequence mitochondrial and nuclear DNA, and they were able to find that the Denisovans living in that part of the world in Eastern Asia, Central and Eastern Asia, not only interbred with modern humans, but also interbred with Neanderthals. A couple of other things. Homo naledi is a new specimen that was found in South Africa in 2013. You may have seen stories about this in the news. It was a pretty big deal when it was found. The material was found in a cave in South Africa. It's basically this cavern that was completely full of fossil remains. So we'll just not go into too much detail here. We'll just say the dates are listed here, 330 to 235. These individuals were smaller than modern humans, about 5 feet, weighing about 100 pounds, and they look like they have kind of a curious mixture of Australopith and Homo-like traits. Brain size is surprisingly small. If we look up here, 330 to 235, they were overlapping with modern humans. They were around in South Africa when modern humans were living in other parts of Africa. So this brain size is really surprising, given how late in time these individuals lived. This is just a picture of the cave site, or a reconstruction of what the cave site looked like. As you can see, there's a lot of fossil material here. So lots of different individuals were found in that site. Homo floresiensis is, you may have heard of before, sometimes referred to as the hobbit species. Homo floresiensis was found on the island of Flores in Indonesia almost 20 years ago now. These were called the Hobbit people because they have very small bodies and small brains. They were found in a cave. There's one cranium and partial skeletons of 9 individuals. The dates for these individuals range from between about 50,000 to about 190,000. They also had some pretty crude stone tools. So what was interesting about this is that you can see the dates again overlap with modern humans, and these individuals, in terms of their body size, look a whole lot more like Lucy than they look like modern humans. So we have some information here, 380 cc brain size. That's, again, very small. That's Lucy-size brain. Very weird for something to be so late in time and have such a have such a small brain. There is a lot of debate as to what exactly they are. Some have argued that they're pathological modern humans, meaning modern humans that have some kind of dwarfism. It's also been argued more strongly, I think, that they are a separate species. What basically looks like it happened, what a lot of scientists think happened, is that it was a Homo erectus population that became stranded on an island, underwent a process called island dwarfism. This is a phenomenon that has been observed in lots of different species where you have a species trapped in an isolated place like an island, and weird things happen to their size, so their size will scale down. So a lot of the anatomy actually looks kind of like Homo erectus, so it appears that this species might be a group of Homo erectus that got stranded on this island and underwent island dwarfism. One more new discovery in the Philippines from the last couple of years. It's very, very similar to what was found on Flores. Another island situation with small-bodied hominins. Late dates, 50 to 65,000 years, might be another example of a dwarf species, group of Homo erectus.